Cool. So we're on agenda, unusually. So James, do you want to kick things off?
Yep. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the session. I'm going to go through a session that I created. Obviously, the title's on the screen. So we're just going to go through a quick introduction, a quick one about myself, how the session came about, and what I hope you can get from it. And it's broken down into two sections. One will be questions around the bring up itself, and then there'll be questions around the day two operations. If it's okay, we'll hold off questions till the end. I've got probably too many slides, so if I can get through them, and then we can cover the questions at the end. So as an introduction, just quickly, my name's James Tiffany. I've worked in IT for 25 years, and I'm currently a technical account manager at VMware. Before that, I worked for a service provider designing VMware Cloud Foundation environments for their private cloud offering. So just quickly around the session itself, it came to me. I've been working on VCF since version 2 now. Back then, we were pretty much lucky if we got hold of a API Swagger document. But nowadays, there is a huge amount of information published. And with that, it actually goes the other way. And sometimes it can be difficult to know where to look to actually find questions that come up. So when I started at VMware, I was obviously able to access a lot more information, and on our internal Slack channels and things like that, I noticed that, you know, the same question might come up several times, and it just sparked an idea that it might be worth putting together a session of some of these regularly asked questions so that it gets out to a wider audience. So the way I've put this together is a question and answer, but obviously I'm doing the questions and the answering. But the reason I did it in this format is it should mean that at the end of it, when you get hold of the slides, you know, you've got a reference deck that you can look through to see the questions and the answers. So one thing to point out is obviously during the presentation, you might notice that there's going to be potentially a lot more no's than yes answers to the questions. Now, that's deliberate. You know, calling these out isn't a slight on the product or anything. What I'm trying to do is get over and share information on things that if you don't do up front and get right straight off, can have a significant impact on the environment going forward. One thing to remember is the answers are based on now, and what I mean by that is obviously VCF keeps evolving. Each time a new version comes out, things change. So I originally wrote this presentation last year, but obviously since then 4.4 has come out and there's been changes, so I had to jump back and update the deck based on the changes that 4.4 introduced. So just take that into mind if you're looking at this in weeks or months' time. And I'm nothing to do with the product team. I've got no access to forward-facing information, so you don't have to worry about any of that type of stuff. So, like I say, we'll cover the bring up side of it first. So, first question: can I change the IP allocation pool from DHCP to static? So this came around in 4.2, where statics, you had the ability to choose between either or. And the answer to that question is yes. There's a link to the KB article on there. But one thing to point out is, although you can do that, what it does do is it changes some of the workflow automation. So on things like cluster expansion and stuff like that, the workflow will still complete, but then you'll have to carry out manual tasks after it. So although you can change it, it does actually change some of the tasks that you'll have to do around that. And on the flip side, if you've deployed using static, can you change it back to DHCP? Unfortunately, the answer to that one is no. There's no documented way of doing it. You can't call up GS or get them to do it either. Question is, why would you want to flip back that way? So to enable stretch clusters, you need to be running the IP allocation in DHCP. So if you have deployed static and you want to expand later on to stretch clusters, at this time it will be a tear down and start again. Can I configure components with uppercase names? Technically, yes, you can, but the answer is no, you really shouldn't. So the reasoning behind this, so in the Cloud Builder workflow, there are validation checks to make sure that the ESXi servers haven't been configured with uppercase names. Uppercase names, while there can cause issues with some of the workflows, so commissioning, day 2 operation workflows, certificates, things like that can be affected by having uppercase names. Even if you've created your DNS entry with an uppercase name, that can cause issues with certain parts of the bring up and day 2 operations as well. So whilst probably technically it is possible, it is highly recommended that everything is lowercase throughout the environment. Can I deploy ESXi hosts on different VLANs to the management components? Now, this question comes up a lot around with security compliance in mind. There's some organizations that require segregation for the hosts from the management components. In a VCF environment at the moment, that's not supported. So the ESXi servers have to sit on the same VLAN as the management components. Another question that comes up a fair bit is obviously you can use VxRail, you can use VSAN ready nodes, and the question is, can you mix those together in the same SDDC environment? At the moment, that's a no. Reasoning behind that is the workflows that a VSAN ready node uses compared to VxRail are quite different. VxRail, you have the VxRail manager involved in it, and that is why when you're doing the bring up, you deploy the Cloud Builder, you log on, and one of the first questions is, are you using VxRail or are you using VSAN ready nodes? And from there, it branches, and the workflows that deploy the SDDC manager and then are used as day 2 operations differ between both of them. So there is no ability to combine the two at the moment. And I've put a link in there that's detailed in the general frequently asked question, which is a great document. It's quite a large document, but you can see there it's question 15 in there. So I'd always recommend that's a good document for looking at to get some questions answered. Can you use IPv6? At the moment, no. So it's one of those ones that is an all or nothing, and not all of the components in the SDDC stack support IPv6 at the moment. So because of that, that means that if one component can't, then it's not offered at the moment. So IPv6 is not currently supported in a VCF environment. And so this question came around. This is a question that came around from my previous role as a service provider, but is potentially more coming back in and becoming more relevant now with the potential of limited availability to hardware. And that's, can I use the same size SSD for VSAN cache and capacity? Now, the answer is definitely yes, but when it comes to VCF, it's recommended that you don't. And the reasoning behind that is the workflow that is that's used to mark the cache disks for VSAN the logic behind it looks through a number of different criteria, but obviously size could be one of them, and what it can lead to is the possibility that you won't have the same universal disk layout across the cluster during bring up, and potentially even in the day two operation. And whilst that can be rectified, obviously it would be a manual task, which would mean dropping it out, playing around and things like that. So if possible, it would be a good idea that if you can to use a different size cache to the capacity. Now, nowadays, you know, most of the capacity disks are much bigger, but like I say, with the potential hardware shortages or maybe having to expand an existing environment, that obviously might become a bit more relevant. There's probably three of the most asked questions in this deck, but this is definitely another one. Is always asked about the ability to skip installing NSX-T, and the answer to that one is no. So NSX-T is a requirement of Cloud Foundation. It's a requirement for the management workload domain, and there's no getting around that. And it is also it's compulsory for at least the first workload domain. So additional workload domains after the first one can potentially share the NSX-T manager, but it is required that at least two in a standard environment are deployed. Now, just because it's installed doesn't really mean you have to use it. Now, some of the vRealize components. So if you just chose to use Cloud Foundation without the vRealize components, you wouldn't need to use NSX-T. The vRealize components with their AVNs, the load balancers, do use some components of NSX-T, but there's nothing to stop you having VLAN-backed AVNs. There's nothing to stop you then using VLAN-backed port groups once you're deployed. It does limit the functionality. You know, obviously NSX-T is there, and all the benefits and the functionality you can get from NSX-T, but you know, you don't have to use that full functionality of it. Anyone who might have seen the bring up process is there's an Excel spreadsheet that you can use to fill in all of the information. Some of the fields are auto-generated, depend on the information you fill in. And at the end of it, you've got a spreadsheet with all the information. You feed that into the Cloud Builder, and from there it ingests it, and then it does a load of pre-checks, and then it starts doing the bring up process. Now, that's great, probably 90% of the time, but there are times when you have to revert to the JSON file. Now, that will be around things like if you want to use your own specific naming convention, if you're looking to use multi-VDS configurations and things like that. So the good news is, yes. So there's on the screen there, it shows you the different ways of being able to from the Excel spreadsheet generate a JSON file. And what's great about that is it then obviously is in the correct format, and it allows you to then make the specific changes you need to without having to worry about, have I got, you know, the right semicolon here, and is it set out properly? So it's great. It saves a hell of a lot of time. So obviously there'll be times when potentially the bring up might fail or stall, and the question is, can I restart that? Now, the reason I've put some specific examples in there are these are definitely ones that you can recover a failed deployment from. Now, there are plenty of other reasons why a deployment might fail. Those aren't so black and white on whether you can retry. It depends on why it might have failed. So calling out these three specifically, password complexity, licensing, and EVC mode, yes, you can recover from those. It would require an API call, because each of those would have failed for a reason. So EVC mode, you might have set Skyline and you're on whatever lake or that reason. So that would require a change to the information, which would mean that you'd need a JSON. So that leads back to the previous slide, that you'd have to go on, create the JSON from the Excel that was used to do the bring up. You can then make the change, and then you can run the API command to attempt to retry. Onto day two operations. So what I mean by day two operations is you've run bring up, it's all completed. So at that stage, you've got 4 nodes, you've got your VSANs there, you've got vCenter, you've got NSX-T, and you're ready to then start building out the environment. So this is one I hit, is when you log on to the SDDC Manager, is you'll notice in 4.3 and above that you don't get the copy and paste and the history functionality. That can be re-enabled, so that has been turned off for security compliance. We'll cover some of that in some later slides, but it's a security requirement. It can be turned back on again. A colleague of mine who helped me with this presentation, he's written an article on it. If you haven't seen his page before, I would highly recommend bookmarking it. He does a lot of VCF work and publishes a lot as well, so it's definitely worth checking out on that. Obviously, turning it back on again, you've got to make sure that in your environment you're happy with that security consideration. Can I deploy an NSX-T Edge Cluster outside of the SDDC Manager Workflow? So the answer to that one is yes, but it's a complex question to go through, in that you need to understand not only use cases but potential functionality that you might lose by doing it. Now, the reason this question comes up a lot is because most people are worried about lifecycle management. If they deploy it outside of the SDDC Manager Workflow, will they still be able to run the NSX upgrades, and will it still capture this edge and upgrade it as well? And the answer to that is yes. No lifecycle management functionality will be lost by deploying outside of it, but you will lose functionality like password management. So you have to understand the pros and cons. There are some edge configurations that aren't supported through the SDDC Manager Workflow. And I was also talking to a colleague the other day that said that on a deployment they'd worked on, they'd moved outside of that construct because the network team wanted to fully manage NSX-T, and that included password management, so they weren't worried about losing that functionality. So yes, it is, but it would be good to understand the reasoning behind it before you went down that route. So this is probably the biggest question that comes up, is around, can I patch outside of the SDDC Manager? I couldn't really make this bigger or bolder, but the answer should be no. So the whole point of the SDDC Manager is to validate and be in charge of those. So going outside of it will break workflows. It will break workflows. You might not notice it now, but when you maybe go to do the next set of patching, it probably won't work. So the default out of the box answer, if anyone asks you, is can I patch outside the SDDC Manager, should be no. Now, saying that, there will be some occasions where VMware will put together a fully KB published article telling you how you can do it. And a prime example is the link in there that was released about a week and a half ago. And that is how to upgrade the NSX-T Manager outside of the process. And that is around being able to get critical functionality fixes out ahead of waiting, instead of waiting for VCF 4.4.1 or 4.5, you've got that ability to do it, but it's a published VMware document. And the other thing to point out is just because it works this time on this doesn't mean that if NSX-T 3.1.3.10 came out and you did the same thing, that it would still work. So there should be no workarounds or trying to get around the system because it will just cause you days, weeks, months of pain with GS trying to repair the environment once you've gone outside of that cycle. Can I add or remove NICs and VDSs? So this comes up quite a bit where after bring up, someone might, a customer might decide that they maybe want a separate VDS for backup, or they've realized that the 2 NICs they've got in there might not have enough throughput and they want to change the configuration. The answer is currently no, and there aren't any data operations to add or remove NICs from existing VDSs or add VDSs and NICs. So at the moment, there are no workflows to carry out that functionality. So that is one of the ones that you have to think about during the bring up process, is to make sure that the VDS configuration you've got is correct for now and will meet your future requirements. And that's why the multiple VDS is available through the JSON bring up, is to allow you to have that configuration from day one, rather than trying to add it in afterwards. So on the multi VDS, following on from that is this is something that used to catch us out a lot in my previous role, is once you've so the question is, can I add a host to a cluster that is using a multi VDS configuration using the UI? And that's the important part of it, because the answer is no. If you are using a multi VDS configuration, and this is another thing, or you're not using, or you're using a different NIC mapping from 0 and 1, then you can't add a host to a cluster using the UI. You have to use it. You have to go through the API to do that. There's the documentation around it. So the good thing is, if you try and add it through the UI, you'll get to a stage where it will come up with a big warning message saying that you're either using multi VDS or a NIC mapping it doesn't recognize, and it won't allow you to go further. So it won't allow you to go all the way through the configuration, do deploy, and then fail. It will stop during the UI process and say, no, you can't go any further. So this is one of the ones I had to change. So can I apply security hardening and turn off SSH on the ESXi servers? So this is actually a multi-answer. So yes and no. So hardening has been around since VCF, I think it's 4.2, and there's a link in there that details. So we've got compliancy for things like STIG, DSS, PCI, or a load of different compliancy, and you could apply those. But one of the things that you couldn't do is turn off SSH. So SSH is required for a number of workflows by the SDDC manager. So what we did is, obviously the feedback was, that might not get some full accreditations. So in 4.4, it's been introduced that SSH is now turned off by default. But a very important thing to point out is, just because it's turned off does not mean it's not required. So now the workflows have been changed that if they do require SSH on the ESXi server, the workflow will actually reach out, turn it on, do the work. Once it's finished, turn it off again. But the important thing to realize is still required. So, you can't be turning off, or blocking SSH and things like that. It is still required, but it is now turned off by default. Now, there are some customers that need SSH for other reasons. So you still do have the ability to turn it back on again and have it stay on. And that's documented in the KB article. And it is also, if you were doing a new 4.4 bring up, you can actually set that in the JSON file to have it as the default configuration. So once deployed, can you change the IP address and or VLAN for the management components? That's just a no, without having to tear down the environment. I've unfortunately been on the end of multiples of deployments where we've completed a fully successful bring up, and someone then goes, oh, that's overlapping IP range, or that VLAN's in use, or numbers of other ones, and there is no way of changing it once it's deployed. So unfortunately, you can't contact GS. There is no workaround. It would require you to tear down and bring up with the correct or the amended information. And that is one of the reasons why, obviously, the forward planning, when you fill in the Excel spreadsheet, why that type of information is so important to get right on day one, is because of the impact it can potentially have to you further down the line. So can I decommission and re-add an ESXi host without re-imaging? Now, the reason I mention this is because it is a depends answer, and the reasoning behind that is, yes, you can in a VCF3 environment. There's a fully documented process, and what I mean by that is, if you've got an ESXi server in the cluster, you decommission it, you bring it out of the cluster, it's still sat in the SDDC manager, and then you can remove it. At that stage, you need to do some cleanup before you can add it back to the SDDC manager. And that cleanup in VCF3 can be done. It can be done using the SOS facility, or there is a documented process on host resetting. Now that works, but sometimes it doesn't always work. So the SOS facility, if you've got things like multi VDSs, it could either slow down the process or cause the process to fail. But it was available. But in VCF4, there is no functionality. So once you've taken the host out of the SDDC manager, the only way to get it back in again is to re-image it. There's no supported go in and uninstall this or reset this or clear this. It is a re-image process. Now, some of the reasoning behind that is the additional complexity that NSX-T introduced in VCF4. VCF3 predominantly ran off NSXV, which had 3 or 4 VIBs. NSX-T has a lot more VIBs involved, but it's specifically called out in the VMware documentation that to once you've decommissioned the host, the only way to reuse it in a VCF environment is to re-image it again. And it will save you hours of work, world of pain, rather than trying to hack it around yourself. So the next 3 or 4 slides are going to be a load of questions around scenarios where you've potentially already got a brownfield vSphere environment. You're introducing VCF into the environment, or potentially the other way around. And the questions about some of the interoperability that could happen between the two of them. So the first question is, can I add a non-VCF ESXi server to vCenter? And what I mean by that is literally logging onto vCenter, doing add host rather than going through the SDDC Manager commission and add host workflows. And that's a no. It's not supported, not even taking into account licensing questions or anything like that. It's not supported in a VCF construct. It will cause lifecycle management issues. And so, yeah, it's not supported. Expanding on that, can I add a non-VCF deployed vCenter to the enhanced link mode configuration? So again, that's the thought process around, you've got a traditional vSphere environment, you've got the VCF environment. What you're looking to do is join enhanced link mode to give you that ability to have the single pane of glass view over both environments. Again, that's not supported. So enhanced link mode is only supported between VCF components. So the workflows, when you deploy a workload domain, will automatically configure enhanced link mode between the management virtual center and any of the workload domains that are created underneath that. And if you had a VCF deployment in site A and you were bringing up another VCF deployment in site B using JSONs, you do have the ability to connect those two VCF instances via enhanced link mode. Obviously, you've got to take into account the virtual center limitation and things like that, but that is there. But you can't add another external vCenter into that enhanced link mode. Can you add a non-VCF vCenter or ESXi server into an NSX-T manager that's been deployed via VCF? No. Again, it's not supported. It's actually called out in the frequently asked question documentation. Again, licensing, lifecycle management, the complexity it adds into it, it's just not a supported configuration. And the final one of this little story bit is, can you configure NSX-T federation to a non-VCF environment? I think you can probably guess from the previous ones the answer to that. So federation was introduced, I think, in VCF 4.2. The majority of it is still manual processes and things like that, but the answer to it, again called out in the frequently asked questions, is no, it's currently not supported. So you can do NSX-T federation between VCF environments, but you can't do federation and join a already deployed or new greenfield, or anything that's not VCF can't be then connected via federation to another existing VCF environment. So can you change NTP NTP and DNS settings. One of the reasons I put this one in is because there was an interesting use case that sparked the question. So the answer to the question is yes. Before VCF 4.4, you could do it, and it was through an API call. VCF 4.4 has brought that into the UI. It's put a lot more checks and automation, and it's made it a lot easier to consume process. But one of the reasons I've added this in is because the question was asked internally was what happens if the customer has their VCF environment, but they also have edge deployments, and that edge deployment didn't have access back to the NTP and DNS that was used in the primary site, and that's where the caveat at the end of it is that yes, you can, but the DNS and NTP have to be same throughout the environment. So if you did have an edge cluster, that would require the same NTP and DNS settings as the servers, say, in your primary data center. So yes, you can change it, but on the understanding that that change is universal throughout the environment. Can I change a deployed edge cluster size? So again, this functionality was released again, I think in 4.2. And the good news is, yes, you can. Prior to that, it wasn't as simple. But what you have to understand is you're not resizing. Basically, the way of moving from a medium to a large edge cluster is deploying two large or a number of large edge nodes into the existing cluster, and then you would retire the other sized ones. So you are changing the size of it, but it's not a go in there, right click and say, change this to large. You have to deploy new devices and then decommission the ones that are there. You might ask why you want to do that. So if you choose the standard deployment of the cluster for the management environment to do the vRealize components, that will have been deployed as a medium size. If you then wanted, if you're using consolidated, say, and you wanted to do Tanzu, that needs to be large. So that would be another time. And obviously, if you got to the stage where your throughput through your environment had gone up and you needed bigger edge devices, that would obviously be another reasoning behind it. So the final slide of the deck is another patching one, and obviously we did mention it earlier. So patching of the vRealize components has always been probably one of the biggest asks from customers, because functionality patches, security patches at times, and things like that obviously would have been coming out in the BOM, and sometimes customers weren't able to wait for those, so they were asking, can they upgrade, say, VRA to the latest patch version and things like that. So it's definitely one thing that the product team have listened heavily on, and that's why it's such a convoluted answer. So for VCF 3.10 and above environments, there is an article there that you can go in and you can disassociate the vRealize components from your VCF deployment. And what that allows you to do is to carry on then patching outside of worrying about the SDDC manager. So that's fully documented that you can carry out yourself. That is going to be a requirement for things like in-place upgrades later on. So that's there. For VCF 4.3, No, is the answer, because if you've deployed in SDDC aware mode, then the SDDC manager is the source of truth for the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager about getting its patch bundles. So you can't patch outside of that process without breaking things. But the good news, in VCF 4.4, things have changed, and now the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager becomes the source of truth for the available bundles. So what that means is you're not as reliant on the VCF BOM versions for being able to, say, apply a point patch to, say, VROPS to get over an issue. So you still will be the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager is still controlled, so you're still incumbent to what the Lifecycle Manager supports, but you then have that flexibility outside of that to be able to patch and upgrade without worrying about the SDDC Manager. So that's it for the presentation. So at the end of it, like I say, the amount of resources that are available is amazing. You've got the release notes, you've got validated solutions, you've got hands-on labs, you've got the product pages. The demo pages are amazing. Even the other day, I was talking to a colleague who asked a question about licensing and when it applied, and we were able to walk through the demo and add a commission, a host, and then add it to the cluster so that you could actually see the process and then work out exactly where things happen. So those are invaluable as well. And just a few takeaways. Obviously, planning is key. You've seen through there things that might be able to be changed in a traditional vSphere world can't be changed in VCF. So planning is important. Don't patch outside of the official process, and it's not trying to be rude, but education is quite key. Is people for the last 10, 12 odd years have been used to carrying out tasks in a very specific way. Add a host into a cluster, you log on to vSphere, do it that way, and it's just making people aware of where they need to go to do certain tasks will save so much heartache later on. So let's have a quick look at questions, if there are any.
So I guess, so that's good, Jay. So thanks for that. So I think, is it kind of fair to say then we've seen this before with other parts of the VMware suite, where this is essentially an assembly of different services, but that means it obviously has to be operated in a specific way with those dependencies, constraints in mind, right? So, but I think that's useful. Outside of this deck here, which I think is kind of a useful artifact out of this, but is this sort of publicly available anywhere else?
Yeah, so everything, all of almost all of the answers come from publicly facing documents. The problem is there are a large number of them, and things like this presentation is fine to be shared. To be honest, I had to cut this down. I could have probably done another hour on additional ones, things like changing what components can you change names and things like that. So all of the information is out there. I just thought it'd be a good format to.
Yeah, I think it's good. You almost need like a product FAQ, right? Which because I remember doing something similar to this with what was it, when VCD first came out, because VCD had sort of other subcomponents, which meant it had to be assembled and operated in a very specific way. And I think that's something that would be good to get pushed out more, because it saves people a whole bunch of time, right? Because if, as you say, each of these individual things, it will probably it will probably take you, I don't know, days of effort to figure out that you can't do something, right? Which is useful if you know.
And this is obviously in the links I put in there. But yeah, the frequently asked questions is definitely a good place. I think there's like 95 questions in it. I think when I was looking through it. So yeah, that's definitely a good place. The release notes holds a hell of a lot of information as well. Validated solutions, things like that. Is all of that information's there. It's just making sure that it's you understand it up front before you potentially make a mistake that'll impact you later on.
Cool. So have many people in the audience done work with VCF? I was always interested to see how kind of widely adopted VCF is as a product. We know that. Still a fairly small audience, but so I mean, what sort of organisations? You don't have to name names, but I mean, what sort of orgs do you see adopting VCF? What sort of industries?
It literally is everything from banks to supermarkets, enterprises. You know, there's even into you know, ones that we can't talk about type things. There's its adoption is fairly wide. You know, it touches most industries, I think, nowadays. Cool.
Okay, so that rather neatly brings us into, so we've basically got an hour break now until we kind of come back at 2 to look at a horizon topic. So it depends. I mean, people want to, I'm quite happy to hang around here and have a bit of chat if people got some topics we want to talk through, or we can come back in a bit. So, you know, we'll leave it open, right? If you want to turn your cameras on and bring your sandwiches, that's also fine. I will have to go and make a sandwich, but I can come back. Just if I was going to throw a couple of questions out that I thought would be interesting to discuss, and these aren't necessarily particularly VMware orientated questions, but be interested to see what your organizations do. I mean, you know, I can see we've got pretty good spread of people who work, you know, for software companies and just right.
And then we're YouTube, and then